Welcome to the last but one presentation today at the Human Factors in Diving Conference, the second day. And this one we've got a slightly different format. We're going to have Pierre and Robin talk through a presentation primarily by Pierre, but Robin's going to basically lead the narrative through, lead the questioning through, in which we're going to talk about an accident at 156 meters. So JP has been an active commercial diver since 81, and has worked from 81 to 88 doing inland work, and then from 1989 onwards, offshore air diving and saturation diving around the world. Now, this presentation is about an accident that happened in the North Sea in 2016, and how by including human factors prior to the beginning of the project, a serious undesired event could have been avoided. What I'll do is hand it over to you two now, and off you go, gentlemen.
Gareth, thanks very much for the kind introduction, and Pierre, I think it's appropriate also to thank you very much for taking time today to talk to us about an event which occurred while you were busy doing your routine day job, shall we call it that. And before we go on to that, over the last 2 days we've heard many wonderfully rich, context-rich stories, and I have to say, this is no spoiler, by the way, I have to say yours is certainly no exception. Now, you do have quite an unusual job, Pierre, but perhaps you could tell us briefly about what you do.
Well, what's a bit abnormal for you is normal for me. I've been a commercial diver now, as Gareth has mentioned, since 1981. And from 1989 onwards, I started working offshore. 91 did my saturation diving course. And I worked mostly on the west coast of Africa. I've worked the Middle East, the east coast of Canada, and the North Sea. So I've been fortunate to have traveled just about around the world and have been exposed to different cultures and work ethics.
And Pierre, experienced, and you are vastly experienced and as competent as you are, this unfortunately did not prevent an incident occurring which nearly robbed you of your life. Now, as painful as it is, can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, Robin. Well, this is the first time I've spoken about it very openly and publicly. And for quite a while, I was struggling to try to make sense of it all, and had to deal with a lot of uncertainties as if I would be able to return to work because I had a burst eardrum. But more importantly, it was about not telling my spouse what had really happened. And my spouse is very switched on. She's a psychologist. So when I came back with a burst eardrum, she asked me what happened, and I told her differential pressure had caused it. And I waited 3 years before I finally told her what had occurred, in a very serene surrounding and peaceful. So basically, this is a story of an undesired event that occurred on May the 9th, 2016 in the North Sea on the Murchison field that was at 156 meters during a decommissioning phase at 0641 in the morning. And what it is, I had concerns about, we had to cut this, a doubler plate on a tow head inside a structure, which I will explain a little bit later. And I can only say that I was pleased. I only had 25 millimeters, an inch of steel left to cut before the job was completed. And just when I said, make it cold, there was a shock wave that hit me on the forehead and on the chest as if I got hit by a sledgehammer. No, don't get hit by a sledgehammer.
Thank you for that very sage word of advice, Pierre. what you've just described, I'm sure is going to be quite hard for many to visualize. Fortunately, we have a video of the incident you are describing, and that video was recorded by the ROV, which, as per standard practice, was observing your operation. Let's play that video, and perhaps you could talk us through it, Pierre?
Absolutely. Every time I watch it, I get inoculated by it.
Here we go.
So there I am at 156 meters, just about to finish that final cut at 25 millimeters. I'm about to strike an arc now, as you will see shortly. There it is. And the rods only last 15 seconds. And on the 7th second, something had changed. And then there was an explosion, as you can see. So I'm in position now again, and the arc is about to be striked. And just when I said make it cold, the cut was finished. You can see just about now I passed out. So this was caused by the accumulation of hydrogen. Even though I did my utmost to chase it, it still accumulated. I think we have a little bit of a problem with the video here.
We do. Please just roll, Pierre.
Okay, I will carry on. So basically, I was not unconscious, and all you could hear in the recording is a rattling breath. Diver 2, which was about to intervene, was 3 to 4 meters away. He was concussed and had tinnitus to his ears. Even though he was in that condition, he still managed to do a rescue. He made sure my umbilical is out of the structure, not to get snagged before recovery. And now he's dragging me on the seabed and trying to keep my head up so I could start breathing. He's not aware that I'm not breathing at that time. And he has to drag me 20 meters on the seabed. And at the same time, he has another 12-meter climb. But during this time, he secured his lanyard onto the D-ring on the back of my harness. He established a free flow on my hat to vent the helmet. And to facilitate the recovery to the bell, he inflated both stab jackets. All this time being monitored by the ROV. That's why we have that footage right now. You will see my legs at one time, like you can see on the video, are moving. I'm trying to breathe. Even though I'm unconscious, all you could hear is a rattling breath. And I'm aware that as time is going on, I'm still not breathing. So now the Diver 2 is just about to climb 12 meters up. And you can believe me, with somebody who's been concussed and has tinnitus, he's struggling on his own now. Fortunately, the bellman inside the bell, he heard the bang, and even prior to getting instructions from the supervisor, he started flooding the bell up to a meter inside to facilitate the recovery of my body. He prepared the band mask and was ready when required to lock out to assist Diver 2. And there he is climbing, and you can see nothing is happening on my side. He's just carrying a dead weight. And by the way, that is the fastest rescue that's ever been done on an unconscious diver. And now here's the clump weight where the bell is. And Diver 2 did a great job in handling me across without banging my head and body. And I'm still not breathing then. And he is just about to secure that man lift onto that D-ring in the back of my harness. And as soon as they started coming up where I was in a vertical position, I started breathing on my own. Probably the second best breath I've ever taken since birth. Then I was pulled back inside the bell. The bellman took the helmet off my head. And to be honest, I felt like crying, but crying because tears of joy. But I did the manly thing. I didn't do it because there's a video camera watching me, and this was recorded in the black box and probably part of the investigation. I'm laughing now. It wasn't then. So once the bell was recovered, we were returned on surface. I had the DMT, the diving medical technician, did a full assessment on me. The authorities were advised, and after an 8-hour hold, we started the decompression, which lasted over 5 days with a thumping headache and a burst eardrum.
What an incredible story, Pierre. Having seen what happened to you, I'm sure by now we can all appreciate the significance and the high-risk potential of what happened. Burning question for me is, what in your opinion were the factors which contributed to this incident?
Well, one of them, Robin, we have to go a little bit back in history. In 2016, when this occurred, the oil industry was already in a downturn for 2 years. And, you know, we were struggling to get work because the price of oil was so low. The market was very competitive, and everybody's trying to stay afloat. And as usual, the lowest bidder generally always gets the work. And the company I was working for back then, we could say it had the lion's share of the work. And that kept us busy, and we were happy working, you know? So something else too. Could this have led to insufficient time for planning between the time the job was awarded and the start of the project? Well, obviously, I don't have access to any of these documents. I'm not aware of, so it's not a subject I'm going to dwell upon. Possibly the engineering side was disconnected with the job, and reason being, you can only plan what you have as background information. Something else I found out was later, that the engineers that we had on the project, because we follow procedures dictated by the engineers, had no real experience in decommissioning work and even less in oxy-arc burning. You know, no doubt the whole idea was to get the job done, to move on to the next phase. So the frustrating part was they're not listening while we said that there was no need for this cut, you know. And if they would have lowered the crane as suggested, I think we would have recovered that towhead as required. And even diver 2, because when confronted by the engineers that they absolutely wanted this cut done, I said, well, get a second opinion, ask diver 2. Diver 2's opinion was the same as mine, and it was just dismissed as if we had said nothing. So we missed out on a learning opportunity here. And something else too that had occurred was I had shattered my faceplate, but we'll come back on that. You know, there were red flag warnings, and I knew there was something that wasn't quite right. And the information to us that was given during our briefing missed out on certain things. A more delicate subject is egos and personalities. And I'm raising my hand on this one because with hindsight, I can honestly say that my ego got the better edge of me, because I was considered as a good burner and always managed to get the job done. You know, at one time or another, you silence that gut feeling you have of something quite isn't right, but you still want to get it done. And that was cutting that second doubler plate. Even though on the left-hand side, when I had previously burned that one, there was a small explosion that had shattered the glass of my burning visor. That was the cue something was wrong, and I didn't listen to it because I just wanted to get that job done and over. And when you think about it, only 25 millimeters was left, and 7 seconds later, my life was hanging by a thread. And poor communication was probably part of the equation on all that.
Many complex factors indeed, Pierre, which to many in the audience will not necessarily be a surprise, especially if they've attended all the talks over today and yesterday, but definitely worth capturing in the context of what happened to you. Now, after this incident, and I know from our discussions, as part of your own personal development, I know that you chose to learn more about human factors, and you chose to do that with a view to applying any learning points from this incident and your considerable experience to your professional diving. Could you now share your thoughts with us, this time looking at human factors rather than the all-encompassing macro factors we've just discussed?
Yeah, we can look at this one of each to start. Work as imagined versus work as done. The office planning versus reality. The work is planned in a certain way, but it is dependent on the information and the blueprint, etc., versus what the reality is on the job site. You know, we have to remember that the industry was in a downturn period, and work was scarce, and everybody's struggling to stay afloat. When you're working with old assets, you're dealing with many uncertainties, and because the information concerning them is not necessarily available to the engineers and the planners in the office, etc., before we could even start removing this structure that we were working on, there was a lot of trawling gear, fishing nets, cables. So that there's another delay. And oxy-arc burning, which you've seen me on the video doing, was only a contingency, wasn't the primary means for the recovery of the structure, for cutting that structure. Let's look at communication. Well, I think basically people are superstitious because in the word communication, there are 13 letters of the alphabet in there. So people fail to communicate. I always say it as a joke, but sometimes I wonder. The surface team versus the subsurface team. I think something got lost in a translation somewhere. And as always, our diving supervisor would brief us to the best of his knowledge of what the job had to be done. But if he's not aware of what had previously, he can't transmit it to us. And the question is, why wasn't that transmitted to him? The previous explosions. We'll come back to that afterwards. And every day we had to deal with uncertainties. And, you know, we adapted to it. And everyone had to follow the procedures because in the offshore industry, we work with procedures. We can talk about operational drift. You know, we're adapting to a dynamic situation. Could we have been cutting corners, you know, to achieve goals? And as reported a little bit earlier, remember when I said coal cutting technique was the primary means of recovering the structure, but because of the difficult access and the geometry of that towhead, we didn't have the right tool for that. So that's why the oxy-arc burning was used. 3 months later, when I recovered, I went on a job in Denmark, and we had what they call a high pressure water jet and a grit entrainment that accomplished the job very easily. And the irony of it all, to be honest, is that a year later, the ROV recovered the structure and there was no need to cut that towhead. Can we talk about maybe organizational drift? Inherited flaws in procedures, not blaming anyone, but if they lack the knowledge and the information, they can only give us what they have, And it's a huge topic, and we don't really have time to dwell on that. What about normalization of deviance? Previous explosion or blowbacks, and my burning shield having been broken, that should have been the cue card that something isn't quite right. We need to think about it or just stop the job before we push those boundaries too far. I can say we did it. And instead of listening to all these cue cards and warning, I just wanted to get the job done at the end. And there was pressure to get it done. Let's talk about situational awareness. I think was a complete loss, surface and subsurface team. Give an example in dive control, the supervisor. If we want to talk about multitasking, the supervisor speaks to 2 divers in the water. He has the engineer next to him dictating what the procedures are. He has to speak to the deck crew when lowering equipment to us. Then if there is a major load, he speaks to the crane operator. Then he has to speak to the bridge. And then he has to speak to the client rep and the OCM, which is basically the superintendent. So that's quite a bit to deal with. Situational awareness, where we said there was something wrong, we shouldn't be doing the burning, but we were ignored. So basically at the end, we were obsessed by the completion of this job, and authority gradients. Decision makers are not listening. It is quite frustrating when your opinion is being discarded and you're told to just follow the procedures by people that have very limited knowledge, and even less about burning. Also, the briefs, there was no mention, as said before, about these explosions that had occurred previously, even though they were recorded in a black box, And this information only came out of the wash once we were all on surface and we had a debrief after watching my accident, the whole video of my accident. And then the other diver said, well, we had explosions too, and so there you go.
Pierre, you've given us lots and lots of food for thought there. And I know you like telling a story. You're very good at it, as we can hear. You have another story for us, I believe.
Yes, let's make it a little bit lighter now. Let me tell you the story about Freddie. Now, Freddie's a big Maori diver that works on our vessel, but he wasn't on the job when this occurred. So Freddie, after a rugby match, was in this local pub in Plymouth, and as he was ordering a pint, at the bar, he overheard these two guys that were divers having a conversation about how this diver burning in the North Sea got knocked unconscious. So Freddie, being Freddie, butted into the conversation. And they said, well, yeah, it happened on this vessel. He said, well, I worked there. And then they said, oh, well, you know, it happened to this foreigner who could barely speak English and probably had a hard time understanding English, you know. So Freddie said to them, well, it's easy for you sitting down having a pint, you know, basing yourself on hindsight bias from comments from people not being on the job. And I think they felt they overextended their welcome in this local pub and left, you know.
From your description to me of Freddie, he certainly has a physical presence, shall we say. So I'm sure that that hastened the departure from the pub. But, you know, isn't it amazing? It's definitely a case here of, you know, why let the truth interfere with a good story? Pierre, after this very close call for you, I have some questions, and I'm sure there will be others at the end of the presentation, but I'm just going to throw some questions out here just now. I'd like to ask if it's changed your attitude to diving. I'd like to ask if it's changed the way you approach your diving. And perhaps of greater importance, do you think that others may have learned from this incident?
Well, it has been a game changer for me. But before we go about it, I think we should maybe watch this video again. And now that people have acquired a bit more knowledge, and you've heard me talk about it during the whole video, and you've seen how I came close to death, let's look at this video. And why not consider your own diving and some of the cues you might have missed out?
Let's take a look at that video now, Pierre.
So remember, I'm not a happy camper. I just want to get this job done now. In the back of my mind, I was concerned about having another explosion. And there we go into the 7th second. Knocked out unconscious. Diver 2, even though being concussed and having tinnitus, is doing an impeccable job doing a rescue, considering all things. You know, for years we've been moaning about having to do rescue drills, but it paid off at the end, you know. And there he cleared my umbilical. He is trying to keep me in an upright position to tilt my head so to have good airway management. He's securing his lanyard. Like that, his hands are free to be able to climb up the umbilical. He's free-flowing my hat because he didn't know if my hat was, if the faceplate was shattered or flooded. So we always practice that. He's also going to inflate his stab jacket and mine to make ourselves lighter. So when he climbs our umbilical 12 meters up, he won't be struggling. There you're just about to see my legs trying to move because I'm trying to breathe, but aware that this is not good at all. I'm aware that it's been over an hour, a minute. I'm not breathing. I'm aware that probably then I thought I was going to die. And the hardest part about it, it's not about dying, it's letting go. And then it gets easier. There's a leg moving and then nothing. He's still inflating our stab jacket. And as I mentioned previously, that is the fastest recorded diver rescue done within 3 minutes from the moment the explosion occurred. You can see the advantage now of having that lanyard. His hands are free to climb up. And actually, that might not be a bad thing. Maybe some of the tech divers should carry a lanyard with carabiners on them, if required, you know, so they can have their hands free. He's climbing up, doing a brilliant job. The bellman flooded the bell. He didn't wait for instructions. Again, because we practice this regularly. How often do people in the diving field practice safety drills? The man lift is down and he's about to secure it to the D-ring on the back of my harness for the lift. And as mentioned before, best second breath in my life.
Every time I watch that video, Pierre, I'm in awe. And I confess, and I've mentioned this to you, but for the benefit of the delegates, I confess the first time I saw this video running, even in spite of knowing that this was no drill, I thought, my goodness, this went so well. It was almost like a staged drill. But as you said, over many years and prior to every job, you and the team had to work together going through this and many other drills. And we're very thankful, Pierre, that you did, because it gave you the opportunity to be here today and to tell us your story. Now, Pierre, you mentioned that this incident, as quite understandably, has changed you in a number of ways. Could you now talk us through that by way of bringing this, quite frankly, fascinating discussion to a conclusion?
Yeah, well, before that, I had an afro, and now I have no more hair.
You're in an exclusive club, Pierre, but let's not go there.
No. I took a burning instructor course, which was quite an eye-opener. And instead of trying to forget and move on, I decided to be curious about it and try to understand and mitigate situations like that so it wouldn't repeat itself. In 2018, I took a class given by John Carl Roth, who's a subject matter authority on oxyart burning. And I've always been interested in diving safety and well-being. And that's when I had the privilege of doing the 10-week webinar class of human factors given by Gareth, which permitted me to articulate quite a few thoughts, and I'm very grateful of it. You know, in the offshore industry, you know, we have all these online courses, safety meetings, safety report, incident bulletin, refresher course taken on a regular basis, which are all good. But unfortunately, some of this is very peripheral, you know. And if lessons are to be learned, you need the whole picture, the rich context to be able to draw lessons. So if we should fail, we could fail safely. In my case, I failed safely. And people need to know that there is a safe culture, and we could speak up without the fear of retribution. And for this to happen, well, even though we can speak psychologically in a psychologically safe culture, we still are accountable. But it shouldn't just be us, it has to be everyone. And I'm also involved in reopening certain diving incidents that occurred in Canada in an attempt to bring in human factors to try to change the dynamic. You asked me if I really think people or others have learned from my incident. I think that's a tough question, because when you read the official reports, vital information is lacking, and that makes it very difficult for other people to learn from it.
I think that last point, Pierre, is a very familiar theme, and it's one that's been repeated a number of times yesterday and today. And I dare say, as an industry, we have a lot of work to do in that particular area. Pierre, I want to thank you on behalf of all the delegates for taking time today to share your story with us. Not only the details, yes, that was quite a horrendous incident, but also let's not forget it. And Gareth mentioned in a previous session about positives, because you've also taken away a lot of positives from what happened, and I know you've worked hard to share those with others in the industry as you have today. So, on behalf of us all, I thank you very much indeed. I believe we now have time for questions.
Indeed. JP, Robin, thank you very much for that fantastic and fascinating, and actually from your point, Pierre, emotional story. The fact that you didn't tell your wife for 3 years about something that happened is quite amazing, really. And I know technical divers who've been involved in events who haven't shared with their partners how close things got to a critical failure, a fatality. So thank you for that. It's not an uncommon event, and I think it's one of the things that you might know that there's risks involved, but not necessarily understand that the full piece. Now, I've got a question, because I've been, from when you and Robin were on the class together and talking about trying to bring human factors into the commercial area. So I suppose a question to both of you really is, is there a place now? I think that's a bit of a sort of a given, but is the industry ready to have a challenge and rethink how performance is done and how adverse events occur? So I'll start with you, Pierre, and then go over to you, Robin.
Yeah, I think the industry has reached a maturity level where the perspective of human factors could bring in safety culture to the next level. Now, it's also something that can vary geographically and because of cultures and ways of going about it. I think like the North Sea, Canada, Australia, and it depends on the individual. They can bring this in. The potential is there. But as you know, certain cultures are very closed. Well, even in the diving community, agencies, etc. But it's one step at a time.
Totally, and thank you for sharing that story, because I think it gets there. Robin, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that I think since my own presentation yesterday, Gareth, there have been so many common threads running through each of the presentations, and Pierre on more than one occasion mentioned culture, and earlier today, we had the benefit of a specific discussion on culture and national identity and all the factors that pull things together. And that, to me, is perhaps one of the challenges, because this is an international industry. And if we have one segment of the industry attempting to, albeit to do the right thing, but perhaps to be seen by other geographically located parts of the industry to be imposing their will, their own beliefs, their own structure, then it can naturally result in some pushback. Now, that sounds negative, and I want to finish on a positive, because I can say categorically that in my dealings so far, I've seen absolute shoots of growth around the change, around the willingness to embrace the kind of dialogue the kind of story and dialogue that I know Pierre has triggered today. So I'm rather positive about it. Hard work is needed, but I'm rather positive about it.
Excellent. And I've always got you as a positive person. So thank you, Robin. Now I've got Dave Conlin, who is on just recently. I'll bring onto the stage. Dave, over to you.
Well, Pierre, I have a comment and a question for you. First off, chapeau for your partner for getting you out of something. And my comment is I also went through something not quite as horrifying as you, but I should have died underwater. And people ask me, how am I changed? And I think that, it's easy to focus on the institutional change and the procedural change. And, but for me, I think that one thing that did change is the realization that our lives are not our own.
No.
And, they belong to the people who love us and the people who care about us. And when we're gone, we're gone. And we don't know that. And I think that looking at safety, and you have to realize that you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for the people who care about you, because you will be the hole in their lives when you're gone. But sort of editorializing aside, and I apologize for
no, that's fine.
Some of your stage, but my just a simple question: was your partner, was he given an award? Was he honored? Was he? I'm hopeful he can't buy his own drinks anymore in the pub. But was there any sort of formal recognition that he had done what he should have done and done it extremely well?
Well, I think management bragged about it, but it wasn't like the Chris Lemon accident. It happened. We worked both for the same company. There was no fanfare. There was no nothing. Well, no. They said thank you to him, and they used a video as a means of showing the best rescue that's ever been done. Well, that's about it.
Yeah, that's a pity. That's unfortunate.
It is a pity. And I remember I was in New Orleans at the underwater intervention. I bumped into one of the managers from the company I was working for. He was giving a presentation on my accident. He says, "You're going to answer the questions at the end." So I felt like, I was in a very uncomfortable position. And that's why I came out with that story of communication, because people said, "Well, what do you think?" Well, it's communication. People are superstitious because of 13 letters in it, so they're not communicating. But back then, already that mouse was running in my brain about, even though not knowing about human factors, that everything is interlinked, And everything that could go wrong went wrong. And even when I'm not going to go into certain details, but anyway, nobody is to blame, but the system was defective. But it has a lot to do with, the price of oil was down, and my ego got in the way, yeah, because when there was burning, I used to do the burning. Actually, if you go on the, you could, I'll leave my email address, because there's certain things that I don't want to speak in public, on the personal level, no problem at all. But yeah, it's been a bit difficult, but you have to move on once you made peace with it.
Yeah.
But I think you should never deny what happens. There's a guy I know on a familiarization dive in the North Sea. He was the bellman. The diver died probably of immersion pulmonary edema on a familiarization dive at 140 meters. And this guy was in total denial. The bellman was in total denial of what happened. He gave CPR, was just blood coming out. And he came back and sat like a month or two later. And I tried to talk to him, and I said, no. I said, it's all right, mate. It's over now. It wasn't over, because a year or two later, his brain went tilt, and that was it. He said, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think in tech diving and in yourself, drinking isn't going to solve the problem, and it's not numbing yourself, or you have to sit down and think about maybe your own mortality and the choices you make. And maybe that's an invitation to look into maybe the whole process and procedure of how we go about things, you know?
And I might get a help with that. So Dave, thank you very much for that question and the comment that's associated with that. I've got Laura Walton, who actually specializes in this. So I'm wondering if this is what she's going to talk about, but if not, I'll follow up afterwards. So Laura, come up on the stage. Just turn your camera on.
Yeah, no, it was on.
There we go.
Hi. Yeah, pretty much. Thank you for getting that right. Yeah, thank you for describing that. It's really. I really appreciate you sharing that story and for us to kind of understand what happened there. And you're already kind of talking into both Dave and yourself, already talking into kind of the area I was kind of hanging back on asking a question about. But the question I want to ask is not so much for you personally, or if you want to comment personally, certainly do. But I'm just curious. I'm a clinical psychologist,
Yes.
and I specialize in, attempting to develop specialism in diving psychology, because I think it's such a different environment. It's a bit like we have aviation psychologists, but we don't have diving psychologists. And, you're talking there about the psychological trauma of this kind of event and people just kind of cutting off, not knowing what to do with it. So I was just curious, within that industry and within, the organizations that I'm not especially familiar with, is there that support existing? Are there systems that are there to support people when there've been accidents?
Do you remember in 2013, there was a helicopter crash off the Shetlands? Where the pilot broke his back, and I think there's 4 passengers out of 12 or 16 that died. It was a mistake. It was a foggy day. What do you expect in the Shetlands? But anyway, I did the body recovery on that helicopter with another diver. And then they invited a psychologist on board because we went and sat. And then I think when we were decompressing, we were along the quayside in Lerwick. And a psychologist came on board and spoke to us. I was still in SAT and she was in SAT control speaking. She says, would you like to talk about the issue of recovering this body? I said, I don't have anything really to say, because I volunteered to do it and I've done it before, because it brings closure. This is what I see. It brought closure to the family, and that was the most important. And it wasn't traumatic. He was dead. He wasn't mangled, and there's not like the medic on board saying there's crabs probably creeping out of his mouth. It's like the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only, when they recover, so they go inside the submarine. But anyway, it's a little bit like the military, I think. The mentality, where I'm talking about that bellman that did CPR on this diver, and he was in SAT, and when he said, "No, that's it, I can't do this anymore," and it has happened to another diver where he was new in SAT. His umbilical got clipped by a reference tugger. It's just something they lower to when they want to lower tools to us. But his umbilical got picked up. And his first reflex was, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. But he wasn't going to die because he could not be recovered on surface. And it's so slow, you could clear your umbilical. When he came back from his bell run, I said, I went to see him and I said, listen, that's something important that happened because you thought you were going to die. I said, it was nothing, mate. It was nothing, mate. I said, well, no, it is something. Maybe you should look into it. Anyway, a year later, I see this guy again. I'm inside a structure. He was inside a structure when it happened. And he's my relief from the other bell run. I give him the tools to carry on the work. He looked inside because we had to go 10 meters inside the structure. He gave me back the tools, walked away, went back to his bell, says, I'm not diving. And that was it. So you're not.
It's trauma, yeah.
So thank you for that, Pierre. Thank you, Laura. We've talked about trim in the past, and I think it's something from the military. I think is something that's probably worth looking at. The military used to have the hard man attitude, just deal with it, but they realized that actually the amount of PTSD that is existing, and even just outside of, I'm going to say, combat operations, when people deal with major trauma events, part of the post-event checklist process is to get trim psychologists involved or a trim team, so that actually you can talk with your peers and understand what's happened, to have somebody who can just listen. So I think it's a really important area, especially when we've got serious events like this. So Pierre, Robin, thank you very much. If anybody wants to more of a chat, if you go to the lobby and go to Hall 1 speaker, you can get Pierre and Robin. For everybody else, you've got 9 minutes, and then I will be closing the conference in the bottom floor, which is Human Factors Diving Conference, open and closing. So the same place that the opening session was, not Hall 1 or 2, but the opening closing one. So, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll see you in 8 minutes.
Roger.